I'm Irene McKisson. I am a co-founder of AZ Luminaria, which is a new nonprofit newsroom that we are launching along with my co-founders Dianna Náñez and Becky Pollack. It is a nonprofit newsroom, and we are dedicated to truly local news and community-centered journalism. Arizonans are telling us that when they read a news story, they want a clear path to act or do something about an issue, that they want to feel empowered and not powerless. They want to feel connected and not divided. And they desperately need information to help their communities. And we need your support to launch AZ Luminaria into a sustainable, nonpartisan news source that's going to help Arizonans all over the state access that information. Until the end of the month, all of our donations are being doubled by our amazing launch donors, Julie and Matt Harrelson. You can visit our website, which is azluminaria.org, to give or to sign up for a newsletter so you can stay updated, which is probably how you found out about this. And now I am honored to introduce Dianna Náñez. She is our AZ Luminaria co-founder and executive editor, and she's going to moderate this amazing panel of people who are going to talk about the state of local journalism across Arizona and the broader context across the country.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. We're so grateful. It brings me so much joy to see our community united. I know that these remain difficult times, and connecting over Zoom is still a thing that I'll leave undefined because we've all experienced it in our own ways. But it's that effort to continue to connect and to collaborate and work on efforts and just make our state and a better place for everyone. I am so excited for these panelists. I can't wait. The reporter in me is in some ways wanting to just listen and be able to take all my notes. So I'm really glad it's being recorded because I will definitely be watching this again to process it in a different way. And with that, I know that we have a tight time schedule. So I want to ensure that we have a little moment for our speakers who I just absolutely respect and admire and in Shondiin's case, have so much love for because we've been colleagues and friends for a long time now. So I'm going to start with Marisol Flores. She's the CEO of B*TCH Media, which is amazing, and I can't wait to hear from her. Marisol, could you just share a little bit about your background and what you're hoping to kind of share today?
Yeah, sure. Buenas tardes. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Marisol Flores-Aguirre. I'm coming from Tucson, Arizona. Hopefully I won't get in trouble for this, but yes, I am the CEO of Bitch Media. We are an independent feminist nonprofit media company. We just celebrated our 25th anniversary, launched out of San Francisco, headquartered out of Portland, but you know, with all things COVID and also trying to get into this really rethinking space intentionally about how we do work, was able to go fully remote. And so we have a fully dispersed staff geographically across the country. We work with hundreds of writers and collaborators. Bitch is mostly known for our magazine. We were primarily a magazine when we launched, and now we have several other programs, including a writing fellowship, a Bitch on Campus program that does curriculum building with universities across the country, speaking tours and other things. So I'm just really excited to be here today. I was invited by Irene and Becky through some conversations that we had around the space of media and information and news. And so we do not do responsive news. We do a lot of critique. Essentially our mission is a feminist response to pop culture. And that's what we've been doing for 25 years. But that is a very broad space and field, and our interpretation of that kind of intersects with all of the major issues that we're talking about today. So really happy to be here. Thank you.
Gracias, Marisol, for everything.
Gracias a ti.
For our communities. And no, you will not get in trouble. I am very proud of you. I appreciate you and your work with Bitch Media and everybody's work there.
Thank you.
Andrew, would you please share? Andrew and I got to actually know each other through this strange world of pandemic these past couple of years. And I feel like our paths were destined to meet in many ways, and I hope that continues. He's the Chief Content and Collaboration Officer at Local Media Association, and really just an amazing person. I'm grateful to know you. Would you mind sharing a little bit, Andrew?
Sure. So yes, I'm the Chief Content and Collaboration Officer at LMA. LMA is an organization that helps newspapers, broadcasters, digital news sites, and R&D partners really figure out new business models for news. So we approach this from that journalism is important, but the business side, which we all know has been challenged pretty deeply these past few years, and especially these past few months with the pandemic, something that we work on. And right now I'm working on a collaboration with 10 Black publishers, Black-owned media across the United States right now to launch a digital news startup called Word in Black, which right now is proof of concept, and we've launched and we're getting a lot of success there. And then I'm happy to announce and share today that I was named a 2022 Sulzberger Fellow. So I'm headed to New York for 2 weeks and doing a project for 6 months, specifically looking at business models that will help aid publishers of color accelerate their digital transformation, and what are the different business structures and ways in which we actually have to stand up news, media, and journalism in ways that we've never been able to do before. So thank you so much, Becky, Irene, Dianna. I'm really proud of you. 3 women leading this cause. We need more local media and local journalism. And I believe what you women are standing up is going to fill a much needed gap here in Arizona, and Arizona is my home. So I'm proud to be helping along in this conversation today.
We are so grateful. Felicidades on your fellowship. That's amazing. I'm looking forward to the service that you provide, because I know that at your heart, you provide our community service. You really hit on some topics about the needs in our communities, and your studies show the needs in our communities. And over COVID, we know even more so that our underrepresented, our marginalized, our historically underserved communities need that more than ever. And many times our communities are colored. So thank you for that. Thank you for sharing. And now I can't wait to hear from I called him mayor when we had our run through show. I'm like, you're just mayor. You're just gonna be, I'm sorry, but you're just former Tucson Mayor Jonathan Rothschild and founder of the Rothschild Fund for Civic Innovation. Would you mind sharing a little bit about yourself, Mayor?
Sure. Sure. Jonathan Rothschild. I'm a Tucson native, which means I've watched the local paper scene since, we'll say since I was 5 years old, so 1960. That's a long time. I'm currently practicing back law, private practice, teaching at the law school, state and local law, and in conjunction with the School of Journalism and the School of Government and Public Policy to stand up programs around civic innovation. And clearly one of the most important parts we'll talk about more today of having a thriving civil society is what journalism brings to that. And I'm not sure it can exist without thriving journalism. I guess the other experience I bring to this, which maybe is why I was asked to speak, is I did serve as mayor of Tucson from 2011 to 2019. For a few years prior to that, I was very active in getting people elected. And even now, 2 years later, I'm still doing that kind of thing. So I think I have a moderately unique perspective about being covered and what makes for good coverage. And also, again, as we'll talk about in a few minutes, the real importance to any community and really the nation of local journalism. So I'm happy to be here and happy to support an effort to reboot, as it were, local journalism, which I think is what's happening here today.
Yes, and that's exactly what's happening. Recharge, reboot, support, collaborate. We know our communities at every level need us to do better. And that's really what it comes down to. So this is a call and a mission. I know everybody joining us today feels that call and that mission for this state that we love. And speaking of love, I love Shondiin Silversmith. I'm just going to say it. I love her as a human, as a friend, as a colleague, as a strong Indigenous woman, and as an incredible reporter who has just, more than just about anybody I've seen ever, not just in Arizona, but nationally, taken really what we can learn about community-centered journalism, and especially with communities that we've failed, that we've lost trust with, that we never built trust with. She has built that trust, and she is currently working as the Indigenous Communities Reporter at Arizona Mirror, and I would love for her to share a little bit about herself and why she's here today.
Feelings mutual, Diana, of course. Yate she Shondiin Silversmith Miche, Honegami Miche, Kiani Bashishtin, Bilgana Dashache, Turichin Dashanala. This is who I am as a Navajo woman. And that's how we introduce ourselves. We introduce ourselves by telling you our background in terms of who our clans and our ancestors are. So that's a big part of who I am, and that's how I introduce myself. I'm the Indigenous Communities reporter for the Arizona Mirror. That is my job as a Native journalist. And I have been a Native journalist for over 10 years now. I've made it a priority in my career to cover Indigenous communities, especially my own community, because I am Navajo and I wanted to be able to see stories about my own community. So in every newsroom, internship, volunteer, anywhere that I've gone that had involved journalism, fellowships, just conferences, anything, I've always made it a priority to advocate or look for ways that these can be applied to covering Indigenous people and their communities, because they have been underserved for too long in media in multiple ways and misrepresented in multiple ways. So I feel that it's been a really interesting opportunity for me in these past couple of years, being able to work as an Indigenous affairs reporter in Arizona, because Arizona is my home. Well, the Navajo Nation is my home, and Arizona is where it's located. So I have found it really interesting in these last couple of years that I've actually been given the professional opportunity to build these beats for the Arizona Republic and now the Arizona Mirror. So that's who I am as a person.
Shondiin, you have more than earned the opportunities to build these beats for two major news organizations, and now with Arizona Mirror. And we are grateful as members of the shared community in Arizona and the shared communities for your work and your coverage, and wish you nothing but success as you continue to do that. We will be following your coverage. And I say that because Arizona Luminaria news organization, nonprofit news organization that we're launching and building with your support, everybody's support here, hopes to partner often and regularly with Arizona Mirror, with other news organizations, because that's how we get this done. That's how we hope to resolve, reboot, recharge, fix this crisis in Arizona local journalism, which is a crisis in our democracy, which is a crisis in our nation. And when we put out the title, Arizona's Crisis in Local Journalism, we thought, well, okay, that's quite we're just getting right to it, which I'm a just get right to it person. So I don't mind. I was like, all right, we're in. That's the truth. I'm all about it. But I know that part of the issue and the issues are that many people have lost trust. And this is surveys in Pew, surveys across the board. We're not just talking about one particular people. We can talk about people who are from conservative political backgrounds, people who are from liberal backgrounds, people who are from Indigenous backgrounds, people who are from rural communities. Across the board, people have lost trust in local journalism. And so when we acknowledge that, we feel that, okay, that's a crisis, because that's a crisis for our democracy. I tell my students, my journalism students often, and people, when I'm asked to speak, that there are a few professions whose are written into our Constitution, and journalism is, because we are meant to serve our communities, be responsible to our civic community minded strength, right? That makes us all united and stronger. And that's a lot. That means something. But I think what we wanted to do in saying this is ensure that if we're not overblowing the idea of a crisis in local journalism, like we want to ask ourselves and hold ourselves accountable. And you saw and heard from our panelists that they're a very diverse, wide group of people with different experiences and backgrounds. And so we felt they were the perfect group to really start off this conversation with, do you think that there's a crisis in Arizona's local journalism? And if so, why and what is that? And so I'm going to start with Andrew and just kind of work my way through here.
I mean, there's no question that there's a crisis happening here and across the US. In particular, in Arizona, a state of its size and its population, based on, per capita, we should have more newspapers, we should have more news outlets, and the reality is that we don't. We've just seen a mass exodus of talent from several local newspapers. And I think, we know that there's a crisis, like we internally in this industry knows that there's a crisis, but I'm not sure if necessarily audiences know that there's a crisis. If you were to ask audiences, and you talked about this, we poll audiences and ask them if they've lost trust with the news. I think we miss out when we ask people whether or not they even realize the news that they're consuming has changed. You've seen consolidation, stations consolidating, newspapers, just judge the thickness of the newspaper, right? And that's the product that goes out every day, that is diminishing. The business model has completely changed. Advertising, as we've known it, as it being the underpinning for which most local news and journalism has subsided on, has completely gone digital. And newspapers are struggling, television stations are struggling, radio stations are struggling. And the behavior of audiences have completely changed, right? How we consume content, the fact that we're in this virtual venue, all of that is dynamically changed. Some of it has happened at a much faster clip than other change, but the reality is the toothpaste is out of the tube, it's not going back in. So the question is, how does new media adapt? How do new things rise? And I mean, living here in Phoenix, right? How will the Phoenix rise from the ashes? That's what everyone has to ask themselves. But definitely there is a crisis. My question is whether or not audiences know that there is a crisis going on. And to the audiences that have not seen themselves represented in content and media, they frankly don't care. They go about their lives every day, whether or not the news is there covering their communities or not. They have to live, they have to survive. And there is a role that we can play in making sure that they, are safe, that there is a democratic a union that represents their needs. But for the most part, journalism also has subsided on itself on primarily white and male audiences. And that is a number and demographic that is also changing too. So the responsiveness of also the demographics of our state and the political cycle that we're in right now should wake everyone up and make them realize that, yes, we are in a crisis.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I appreciate your background and being able to share this. In the 16 years now, I've been a journalist both at the Arizona Republic and now with Arizona Luminaria. I have seen that shift, that evolution of change and cuts and pains at a time over the past couple of years when our communities needed us more than ever.
Yeah, and now we have, vultures coming in. We have large hedge funds that are coming in and swooping in and buying newspapers, pennies on the dollar.
Yes.
And they're going to squeeze out every last remaining penny that they can from those newspapers, down to selling the aluminum on the print machines. Yes. So that is a sweeping movement that's happening across the US. And this panel knows that I'm agnostic when it comes to for-profit or nonprofit media. For-profit media, for the most part, are ethnic-owned newspapers, family-owned newspapers. Nonprofit media has been a big swing the last few years because of just the business model and what that affords people. But there is something happening across this country where large hedge funds are coming in and buying up newspapers at a rate that is unlike anything we've ever seen.
Yes, Save Lee Enterprises. Yes, I'm repeating this because that's what we're experiencing here. And as community leaders, as people who want to serve our community, as journalists, we identify the issue, we provide context, and then we provide information to see how people can unite and get involved in solutions that they choose, right? Not that we choose as journalists, that they choose once they have that information. And so hopefully this conversation moves us towards those solutions and those partnerships. And I would love to hear from Jonathan right now, Mayor, if you would share a little bit, because you are at the heart of what it means to be serving your communities and be on that civic partnership side.
Yeah, so when you talk about a crisis, maybe there's both an internal and an external crisis. And the internal crisis is the one that those in the industry know about, probably hasn't gotten enough broad knowledge out. But again, one of the difficult issues now is how do you get broad knowledge out? I concern myself as much with the internal crisis as the external crisis, which comes about as a result of the internal crisis, which is when you talk about lack of trust in journalism. Why is that? Well, and my interest is very parochial. My interest is in the need for local journalism and what the role of a local paper should be. When you talk about the lack of trust and the need for local journalism, well, why do we need local journalism? Because we all get our national news now elsewhere. We get it on our phone, we get it on our TV. You know, on one side, there's the Wall Street Journal and Fox News and the National Review. And on the other side, there's the New York Times, the Washington Post, and MSNBC. And quite frankly, if on your news feed, you're getting those alternatively, essentially what you're getting is two very different versions of the world. And it leaves people not really believing either. Okay, number one. Number two, it nationalizes the news. So things that become important are on a national level, where, of course, as a mayor, my belief is and remains that what remains very important to people is things that are done on a local level and where solutions can be made on a local level. So what are we now losing by losing the local papers? Essentially, we're losing, and this is from my perception, both on the inside and the outside, a lack of depth, in-depth local news. And I want to be very clear, that's not because there aren't very good reporters still working in the local traditional papers, but it's because the resources are stretched so thin that they can't, on a regular basis, produce the kind of hard news stories that take a lot of work. So, you know, for instance, here in Tucson, not only do we get our news the same way everybody else does on the phone, but our paper is now distributed in Phoenix, which means we see our news essentially 2 days late. I love the sports page. There's no need for the sports page anymore because I'm seeing sports 2 days after it happens. I don't need the national world news, which is 2 of the sections. So what's left, other than, you know, maybe the TV guide and the comics and the Sudoku, is local news. That's it. That's what we need, is local news. So now what is local news? There's the good news stories and the event stories, and you can call that soft news, but that stuff's still really important to the community. What's out there to do? And not just, you know, the concerts, which are important, and the theater, which is important, and the dance, which is important, but what other events are out there? And even that doesn't get the coverage it should get. And then there's the good news stories. And I can tell you as a mayor, and I guess most mayors would tell you that, it could get pretty frustrating when there were a lot of good news stories coming out of your local government, but you couldn't get coverage for them. Just because you know, and everyone appreciates that if it bleeds, it leads, but there should be some room for some of that other good news. But more critical is the hard news stories, okay? And that's what we need good reporters for. And that takes investment, it takes people, it takes research, it takes staff, it takes being able to invest in a journalist for a number of years. You know, you see young people coming out of journalism school, great kids, best intentions, can't find their way to City Hall. Okay. Well, it takes a number of years before those contacts are developed and the like. Well, if you're going to have a rate of pay that if you go to have a family or whatever it may be, you can't be in that, what you really want to do for life, love for life, that hurts journalism. That hurts all of us. So now we've got the traditional model, and the work that Andrew's going to be doing over the next 6 months, I think probably is going to apply across the board. What are the models? And it seems pretty obvious that, you know, if we want to invest in staff, we're going to need to not invest in new paper that prints the paper, the printers, which are incredible capital, the buildings, which are capital, the logistics, the hand delivery of the paper. I love my newspaper. I read it every day. You know, it's part of me with my coffee. But is there an economic model that's going to make that work? And if there isn't, the digital model looks to be the model of the future. But that has its own challenges. How do you monetize it? How do you deal with paywalls? How do you deal with donors versus subscribers? And how do you expand your circulation in the digital world? So those are all still questions to me, but the only way those questions, I believe, are going to be answered is by investing in some of those, I want to call necessarily front runners, because, you know, everything on that phone is digital news, but we don't yet have a great deal of local news. And the traditional guys are trying to get there, but if what they're going to give us is things that we can get elsewhere, they're not going to be successful. And so that focus on that local news is kind of where I'm coming from, what I'd like to see happen. And I think that we're going to need to start developing those strong alternatives now, or else remember what we're losing when we're losing good journalism, strong journalism, is we're losing a good civil society, a good knowledgeable civil society that can enter into meaningful, reasonable debates to get to constructive solutions. That's what I want to be able to have information about so I can do. And I think a lot of people want that. And when you talked about, Diana, the lack of trust, I think it's because people aren't seeing that. Not that they don't trust, but they're not seeing that. And without that, you know, what's the value? So
Yes, yeah, I think that's the heart of it. The heart of it is that local, well, and I say this a lot, local journalism is national journalism with more heart. And what I mean by that is that local journalism is, we live here. we live, breathe, experience everything that our communities are experiencing here. We're not coming in from a national organization, which I support my national news orgs. I subscribe to many. But we live here. And how do we sustain the people that live here, have lived here for many years, have grown up here, who have the experiences here, and maintain them in this environment and buoy that, rather than, you know, the experience that I saw in, and I'm sure I know Becky and Irene with 18 years at the Daily Star, myself in the Gannett newsroom, starting out at a time, and I started as an intern there, starting out as a time where we would cover all of our bureaus, our locals, you know, from the West Valley to the East Valley, and spending time. I remember when I first started covering Chandler and Tempe communities, we had like 6 reporters covering each of those communities. And over the years, that attrition, through layoffs, through consolidation, Gannett becoming the largest print media company in the world, but what does that mean in the nation? But what does that mean? Over time, it was 2 people covering Tempe, and then it was just me covering Tempe. And now in my former newsroom that I love, I know that there are some really hardworking local journalists who are covering 2 or 3 cities. And so that's the reality when we talk about how can we ensure that there are alternative models that hold the community at the heart, instead of a model. There's nothing wrong with profit. There is something wrong with profit when it harms our civic and journalism duties. So with that, I turn to Shondiin, because I know she's had many experiences, and I wonder if you can share, Shondiin, your thoughts on, is there a crisis in Arizona's local journalism, and what is that, and what are your thoughts on solutions?
Yeah, so I think they pointed out a lot of really good issues that is facing journalism right now. But for me as a journalist, and especially a journalist who was working to bring more coverage on a community that has gone underserved since the beginning of journalism and has often been misrepresented and has often had to rebuild that trust with these communities to be able to properly tell their stories. I think one of the biggest things is that people do need to pay more attention to local journalism. That is one of the issues, is because, like he was saying, we consume our news on a national level in a variety of ways. We get our news on a national level in a variety of ways. But when you try to connect that to your own community, there's nothing there. You don't see that connection, and that kind of distorts your view of the media in general, because then you don't feel that these people care enough to come cover your community, or that they care enough to even acknowledge that you're a part of these communities that they're already covering. So for me, when growing up, I always read local journalism. I read my tribal newspaper. I read the smaller local newspapers surrounding the Navajo Nation. But the further you went out, there was just no stories about Indigenous communities to begin with. I mean, even when I started at the Arizona Republic, they didn't have an Indigenous affairs beat. The state's largest newspaper did not have a reporter dedicated to covering 22 federally recognized tribes in Arizona. I mean, yeah, you had reporters who occasionally wrote stories about them, but you never made it a priority in your newsroom to include a community that borders the metropolitan area, that has been a part of Arizona before it was even a state. So it baffles me that when it comes to covering these types of things, that a lot of newsrooms and media organizations aren't taking the time to acknowledge and really incorporate who they're reporting on, especially because they're not taking the time to, they're just not taking the time to make sure that they're including stories and voices from communities that are not often served. And I feel that the sooner that these media outlets understand that these communities are a part of the communities that they cover and are an important part of these communities they cover, the more well-rounded information that you'll get. Because you're right, we shouldn't, as journalists, we shouldn't just be reporting on all the bad things. We shouldn't just be reporting on all of this hard news that people consume on a daily basis, but you should be reporting on communities that deserve to have their stories told. You should be looking at these communities who want their stories told, who have tried so hard to connect with local media outlets for a long time to get their stories told. So I think until until that happens, this crisis in local journalism is going to continue until newsrooms can include everyone's voices in what they're covering, because everywhere that you go, these people are a part of your community. It doesn't matter if you are in Phoenix, Arizona, in Tucson, or in Northern Arizona, in Flagstaff, or on the Navajo Nation. Something that is impacting these communities are impacting everyone in this state. So I think when it comes to reporting on topics or reporting on issues and stuff like that, it's just good journalism for reporters and newsrooms to take the time to understand how this impacts more than just one community, more than just that direct community that they are trying to cater to, because there's more than there's more to Arizona than Phoenix. So
Yes, you hit it. You absolutely hit it. And I mean, when Becky and Irene and I talked about this, and we all talked with our friends and colleagues. I spoke with Shondiin. I've spoken with many people, and what is the idea of building ethical and equitable journalism, which is what we are trying to do and stick to with our mission here at Arizona Luminaria. But we don't just mean with coverage. We mean, with coverage, with partnerships, with collaborations for the journalists working in our newsrooms. As the mayor said, there are so many young, talented journalists, especially young, talented journalists of color, especially female journalists of color who have left their newsrooms in these past couple of years. They want pay. There's young journalists across the board that are just leaving because there's not that equitable coverage. There's not that equitable pay. There's not those opportunities. And I hear Shondiin, and I think of how passionate she has been, and that she walked in the door of every newsroom she went into saying, I serve the communities that I'm from. And that's what we haven't seen, and that's what I'm here to do. And I hope you support that mission. And I know when I entered the door of a newsroom and I was like, wow, they let me in. I come from Mexican immigrants. I come from a family of farm workers who labored in the fields for a better life. And I did not see that accountability of coverage. And I think about that in the context of what we're seeing in Arizona in journalism. And if at that moment, for so many of us, as we enter these newsrooms, and we knew that our communities weren't being covered ethically or equitably, and we see the attrition in our newsrooms, and we see people leaving, and we see massive reductions in coverage, we know to our heart what that means for our communities. So thank you for sharing that, Shondiin. I really appreciate it. And we're here to support, and we hope to continue to work together. Marisol, I know that you understand all of this, and then I'm very eager to hear your thoughts, because I do think there are opportunities. I do think there are opportunities to work together, and I do think there are opportunities for solutions. There has to be. So would you please share with our audience today?
Yeah, thank you for what's been shared up until this point. Really appreciated listening in. I think what we're unpacking here this afternoon is that we're not just talking about a singular crisis, right? Like what Shondiin talked about in her remarks, touched on so many intersections of like what this crisis actually looks like. And when you bring into the fold what Andrew discussed in terms of like, how do we consume content and how are we getting that information? What Mayor Rothschild talked about in terms of like those internal and external implications. And then we put them all together. We're talking about a whole lot of intersecting crises, right? Like when you have indigenous nations that don't have access to not only to news, but also to like, what's the word? Like internet, broadband, right? Like, and we're expected to consume so much of our news through these digital platforms, but there's not only is there not representation, now there's not accessibility. You have that same issue in South Tucson, right? You have that same issue probably on the west side of Phoenix in the West Valley. You have those issues that are affecting historically excluded communities, minoritized folks. You're having these issues across demographic and economic backgrounds, right? So we're not just talking about like poor BIPOC communities. We're also talking about Anglo communities that have been left out of these conversations as well. We're talking about other immigrant communities, Asian. We have a huge demographic here in Arizona of refugees from the African continent, right? And so when this pandemic hit, part of my activist brain went like, how are they getting information, right? If you're a monolingual immigrant, how are you getting information, right? We live on the border. Okay, we can probably access that. And you have folks that speak Spanish in the community, but other communities, how are they being represented, right? And so there's a crisis here with regards to like the just distribution of resources and who gets them and how they're allocated and how that infrastructure is being identified, right? So like this macro issue. And then you have the influx of now big business and a lot of money and buying up these conglomerates, buying up news. And so you introduce a whole new set of problems. When I first heard this term that's now like everywhere, which is alt facts, like what the hell was that? When that first hit the market, right? Like alt facts, people kind of like laughed it off, like, yeah, right, you can't have alt facts. That by definition is false, right? Like there are facts and there are lies. There is truth and there are, mistruths. But all of a sudden we have this narrative around alt facts that totally started to change the game in the ways in which we think about trust and in the ways in which we think about what is credibility and who controls those narratives. The same thing with fake news, right? This like intersection now, and I'm really curious, Andrew, as you start to do your research in terms of now new models that are going to be brought to the forefront, because people are not waiting for news, right? Like people no longer are waiting for news outlets to catch up. They're making their own news. Yep. They're making their own content. YouTube is one of the fastest growing areas. I mean, I talked about TikTok before we got on today. So many ways in which the accessibility of creating and generating your own content to develop your own audiences has completely exploded and transformed the ways in which we consume not only media, but news and information and where we go and who we're thinking about and talking to and who we're listening to. And so I think it's really about transforming the ways in which we are also engaging with those audiences, right? Like, what does that engagement look like? Because I think one of the panelists here said, like the toothpaste out of the tube, like the trains left the station, like we can have all of these different analogies for that. But the reality is that the ways in which we consume any kind of content is now versatile, it's digital. We have much less and shorter attention span than we used to. Mayor Rothschild said, if it bleeds, it leads, but it's also now, is it shocking? Is it funny? Is it, what is it? And you can get it anywhere. And so it's really about how are we also engaging with the content in the ways that are accessible to the readership that we want to be a part of, right? Like the communities that we want to represent. How are we meeting them where they are in the ways in which they want to engage with us? So that's part of the conversation that I'm interested in as well, along with all kinds of other things. But in terms of like that digital story, I think like we're entering into a completely untapped, unrecognizable, I think, future in a lot of ways. When you have real estate that can sell in the metaverse for like $2.7 million, like real money in a digital society, like we've now entered a completely different realm of content and news that's going to transform what we're doing. So I'm interested in that and kind of excited about it too, actually.
Thank you, Marisol. I know that everybody on this panel is deeply rooted in our communities, deeply rooted in our state. Becky, Irene, and I at Arizona Luminaria have 50 years of experience in journalism combined here, but we also live here. Becky and Irene are natives. I've been here for the past 34 years. We've seen the progression, the lack of strong local journalism affect the politics of what is happening here. We know that our issues on borderlands and indigenous communities, with what COVID did on our Navajo Nation, the separation of families, this is when I say that local journalism is national journalism with my heart. We know what happens in our state, and we know how that affects our nation. And so with that, we've seen some really exciting models in Ohio and in Kansas, where local nonprofit journalists and journalism groups and journalism organizations are coming together with their community and finding ways to say, how can we ensure that whatever happens at any form in the other news media outlets that are out there, in the other models that are traditional, we are ensuring that we don't have to break before we rebuild. So with that, Andrew, I think we have a question here, and I want to turn to this question because it leads right where everybody's been talking about. And I am a strong believer in opportunities and rising to the challenge, united. And so this question is for Andrew, and it comes from Kevin. What are we seeing in other states, both good and bad, that could inform what happens here in Arizona?
Great question. The good, let me start with the good and then I'll go with the bad, or maybe not so bad, depends on which way you want to look at it. But in terms of the good, and Dianna just talked about this, you're seeing more collaborations coming together, for-profit media, nonprofit media, independent media, ethnic media, people just coming together, sitting in the same room and saying, hey, how are we going to survive this storm? How are we going to be able to really work together? And to be honest, you know, the technology platforms are playing a role in this too. There's been immense funding that has come in from Google and Facebook and nonprofit foundations and institutions that are seeing a role. Clearly for the platforms, there's a business model that makes sense for them because journalism is a power, right? It's an engine for a lot of digital platforms like Facebook and Google. But then, you know, there's the other side of it, which some folks are uncomfortable with, that there is money coming from the platforms and the technology, social media platforms, and people see, you know, the bad side of that, the evil side of it. You know, my position and our position is, if the money is there, you have to take it. You have to use those resources, whether they're good, bad, and indifferent. And I think that is somewhat of a delicate balance that we play. At LMA, we're very open and transparent with our funders. We have discussions with them, both on the record and off the record, about their positions, about what role technology is playing in democracy. And again, you know, it always seems to be that the technology platforms get demonized as being the bad folks in the room. But, you know, you have to think about it too, like Marisol was talking about. A lot of the misinformation and disinformation that gets produced out there, it's not by a bot, it's not some AI platform, it's, you know, a group of people that are producing misinformation. So we have to be the antithesis to that. So collaboration is one. And the other thing that I'm seeing right now is large media brands like Axios coming in and standing up local news brands, right? So Axios Phoenix, Axios, whatever. These are organizations that are, you know, again, based Northeast, or, you know, they've got funding to be able to come in, but they're not really local media. They're there to really, I would say, usurp a relationship between technology and the audience, which they bring immense technology resources and skill sets to local media that a lot of people can't compete with. But collaboration, I think, is going to be key. Regional collaborations are going to be key. And again, this partnership, this collaboration that we're doing with Word in Black, which is taking 10 Black legacy publishers and bringing them together. They have trust with their communities. They've existed there for a very long time. It's unlike, nothing like this has been done before. It's the first of its kind. So we're testing and experimenting. And ultimately, everything right now is a test and experiment. Back to Mayor and what he said, there is no clear pathway forward for anyone in this space. So lots of experiments need to be done and investments need to be done to figure out, how do we actually stand up new journalism and new media? And some of it will be the old school stuff, you know, the gumshoe reporting, the boots on the ground. And that's what we need in our communities more so than ever. And I will say, in particular, public media should have a very specific role in Arizona between two large public radio stations and TV stations in this state. They had a very unique opportunity to serve the very audiences that you're talking about, the audiences that don't have access to broadband and digital. The TV radio signal is still an important thing. And in a time of crisis, when something happens here, let's just say we have a blackout, what's the thing that you're going to turn on? You're probably going to turn on your radio. Your phone's not going to be working. So I look to those folks and say, hey, step up to the plate. There's more that needs to be done. And a lot that could have been done specifically during the pandemic, in my opinion, that they did not do.
Yeah, thank you for that, Andrew. I thank you for the ideas of, you know, just the model, even with Words in Black, and as I mentioned, the models that we're seeing in Kansas and Ohio, and this partnership, this idea of collaboration. We think of this time and this panel as a start of a conversation. And that start of the conversation means that we have opportunities to continue this conversation, both through AZ Luminaria's panels, through our launch of our journalism, through hosting communities. You know, I would love to see a month from now, we're coming back with Words in Black and doing like this again. that we're being able to truly take in these ideas, process them, and do something better for our state, serve our communities. That's at the heart of journalism. That's what we do. I know that we need to wrap up here. I think if we can maybe quickly get in one last question, and hopefully I don't get in trouble from Irene and Becky for doing it, but I'm going to try. What do we have here? What is the best way to convince journalists that they can have a future reporting for nonprofits? Interesting. I value that. I wonder if, Shondiin, if you could share a little bit about that, because you just recently made a shift in where you're reporting. And that was a big decision for you.
It was. I shifted from the Arizona Republic, which is a for-profit media organization, one of the part of Gannett, which is a massive organization. And honestly, it comes down to how a newsroom treats a reporter. Honestly, if the newsroom takes the time to invest and believe in your work, they will show it. They will give you the resources you need to produce the stories that will benefit their newsroom. I was named the Indigenous Affairs reporter for the Arizona Republic in 2019, and it was the first time this beat was ever created for this newsroom. And I had to build it from the ground up with very little help from news leaders within the organization, because they didn't know what the hell they were doing. They'd never had a beat like this before. They rarely had an Indigenous reporter on staff, for crying out loud. So it was interesting to me that I could be a part of this, one of the state's largest newspaper, and the potential of having national coverage through USA Today and stuff like that. So why the hell was I so unhappy?
Yeah. It was every opportunity.
Yeah.
True.
So I'm like, and in the reality, it was because I know that the Republic and Gannett appreciated my work. And yeah, it did benefit them. But did I feel appreciated? No, I didn't, because they didn't provide me the resources or the compensation I needed as a reporter. I have a master's degree in journalism, as well as over 10 years of experience reporting in Indigenous communities. So why in the hell was I making not even $45,000 a year?
Yeah. Well, that is to answer that question, shifting to nonprofit. And Andrew said, I don't really care for profit, nonprofit. I care about ethical, equitable treatment and coverage for our people, for our journalists, and most of all, for our communities. And that's really equitable journalism is ethical journalism. I say it over and over. Equitable journalism is ethical journalism, and that comes on coverage, and that comes inside our newsrooms. We hope that you support us. We hope you share on how we can support you. We hope to continue this conversation. Follow us at azluminaria.org. That's where we're starting. That's where we'll be launching. That's where we're building the work right now. Hope we can partner with you. And we're on Twitter at AZ Luminaria. Becky, Irene, is there anything I'm forgetting? Because I know I forget a lot of things.
Thank you to the whole panel for taking the time to speak with us and for lending your, unique perspectives and context. I think it's really helpful to hear such a varied group of people saying the same thing.
Thank you so much, Becky.
And you can learn more about our effort in Arizona journalism by going to azluminaria.org. You can find us on Twitter and Facebook and all the social places to follow along with our experiment and see how it develops. Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Thank you. We're so grateful for you. And like I said, please let this be the start of a robust community conversation that continues, and let us partner together. We're here to support you. Thank you. Gracias.
Adios.
Bye.
Adios.